Great. And it's not going to stop, right?
No, it's
awesome.
But I'm here.
Perfect. So, in terms of my entrepreneurial journey, I'm actually an economist by training, and I went to a university that's very business school oriented. And when I was in business, or had business school courses, there was a lot of talk about like people topics and organization topics, and I always thought they were really boring and so irrelevant because I wanted to learn something about marketing, about sales, about like finances, like things that actually mattered, as I found back then. And then after university, I actually started to work for a clean tech company. And once I joined that company, we were about 30 people, and we actually scaled to 120 people in around about 1.5 years. So there was phases of very, very strong growth, and we quadrupled in size. And then I realized that people topics actually matter, and that the sort of speed we kept in terms of actually sort of like sharing knowledge, communicating with another, was something that didn't just happen as we scaled as a company. Like, it was actually quite painful. And we realized that it didn't all, like, there was no very sort of like intentional way to scaling that process. And that created a lot of friction. And that actually made me really interested in people topics and organizational topics. And after leaving that company, I actually decided to sort of join a bit the other side and started working for a German Mittelstand media company. And so all of a sudden I was in this completely different environment where I was very established, where the question was not how to build something and to like make something grow, but the question was actually how do we transform a business that's actually under quite a lot of pressure because like the original business model is sort of like moving away a bit. And all of a sudden, in this completely different environment, again, when we spoke about how do we build new business, we again were speaking about mindset, about culture, about how is information shared, how are people incentivized in this organization. And again, it was all about people and organizational topics. And that really got me thinking. And what I did then is actually I quit that job, and I had the opportunity to go to the Bay Area, to Silicon Valley, and spend some time at Singularity University, which is a bit of a tech think tank. And I used that time to really dig into sort of like how do you actually enable people in an organization. And I think the Silicon Valley is quite an interesting space to look at that challenge because there's so much pressure for talent. Like everybody's trying to hire the same people. So as a company, you need to be quite intentional about how you get people, but also how you retain people. And as you move so fast, and you might not actually always be able to hire the experts you need, how do you actually make sure the people scale with you and that you develop those people as you sort of like go along? And there was a lot of interesting insights through these sort of like own experiences, but then also the exposure to people that in a very data-driven way have optimized and sort of like built people processes. And I went back and already for like the past 2 years before going there, I was actually speaking with a friend of mine who was also in the tech industry, more on the product side. And we always were playing around sort of like balls and discussing like how do you actually enable people in organizations. And at that point in time, we were both sort of like ready to take on new challenges. And we decided to like really dig into this and take it as a design challenge. How do we enable people in organizations? And the interesting thing is, if you look into the data, 81% of companies, guys, you can sit in the front, please come here. And 81% of companies don't actually have good processes or structures for feedback and learning. And if we think about how do we develop talent and how do we make sure people like learn as fast as the company needs to learn, you actually need to figure out like how does feedback and learning work? How do you make sure that people know what they already do well? And how do you make sure that people already know what they're not doing so well and how we sort of like need to work on that aspect and how to improve on that aspect? So 81% of companies don't really have those practices in place. So 80% of talent might not actually be sort of developed or enabled in the way that we actually sort of need it. And that's actually not just bad for the people that might not live up to their potential, but it's actually also bad for the companies that don't actually help these people to perform at their best in this context. And the interesting thing is, it's not that people don't want it, and particularly millennials, sort of like what a lot of the people in this room sort of like probably identify with, are particularly sort of interested and looking for these opportunities to constantly learn and receive that feedback in the context of companies. So it's actually why this talk is called the Millennial Game, because this is something that particularly millennials are actively asking for. And the other side of that sort of like of that challenge is that it's not actually just nice to have to make sure you develop those people, but there's actually studies that show that companies that really thrive at creating this processes and this culture of continuous learning perform 5 times better in terms of their company's growth. So there's a hard case for why we actually really need to consider and care how we build this learning into an organization. In the end, it's the people that help a company or that make or break the success of a company. And in the end, it's the speed at which we learn that really drives and determines our success, especially as early stage companies. But interestingly, as my previous experience shows, not just as early stage companies, but also as companies undergoing transformation. So we also need to figure out at what speed do we actually iterate on our existing business models, and how fast do we learn and adapt at times where a lot of the environment around us is actually changing quite rapidly. So a company can only be as successful as its people, and the speed of learning drives the company's success. And ultimately, I mean, a lot of that is what we call agility as well, right? A wise man once said, success today requires the agility and drive to constantly rethink, reinvigorate, react, and reinvent. So this is basically what makes up success these days, where the constantly changing environment really does require us to change in a constant way. And this is something that we often have really built into our product management and product development processes. We don't do like this, we plan for years or months and then sort of implement sort of pre-made plans. That's like the old way we've developed products. And the new way we develop product is in a very sort of like agile product feedback loop. Like we do something small, like an MVP, we test it, we iterate on it based on the feedback we've gotten, we learn from that feedback, we make a better version of that product. So our whole product development process is grounded in a feedback loop. But we don't actually do that when it comes to our own individual learning. We don't really do that as systematically when it comes to our learning as a team or as a company. So we don't, in a systematic way as we do about the product development, ask ourselves, like, what do we actually do well already? What do we need to improve on? Like, what do we do well as a team? What do we need to improve on as a team or as a company? So we need to build this very systematic feedback loop of sort of like figuring out what we're doing well, iterating that, maybe testing something new, also when it comes to our individual development and our team development. And there's a lot of data that shows that this is really the basis for continuous learning, understanding what you do well and understanding what you don't do well yet. And if you achieve fair and accurate feedback, that's actually really a significant driver of learning, and then therefore ultimately productivity, because you know what to keep and what to change and how to like basically work on your strengths, identify your strengths. It's very important to actually know what you do well, and it's something we often, particularly in Germany, we forget. Like we think only negative feedback is relevant feedback, but we actually also need to really understand our strengths in order to build on them and in order to do more of the things we do well, but also maybe sometimes correct the things that we don't do so well yet. So feedback is ultimately the basis for this learning, and therefore also core driver for this productivity. But the other side is actually that it's also like, if we think about it as people managers or founders, giving feedback in a constructive and relevant way is actually one of the significant core drivers of leadership effectiveness. So there was a big study where basically the researchers observed feedback behavior by people managers. And they looked at how does the people manager actually take opportunities to give relevant feedback to their team in a very sort of like personalized and a continuous manner, and how that actually ended up resulting into the work results of the team. And there was a very, very strong correlation and causality between how this feedback that the manager took the opportunity to always give this relevant feedback, how that effectively drives the leadership effectiveness. So compared to like a manager that barely ever gives feedback, the leadership effectiveness is actually 5 times higher. And even to like a medium feedback giving manager, it's still 75% higher leadership effectiveness that you could observe among the managers. So it's something that helps the employee or helps every individual to develop, but it's actually also something that's like your superpower as a leader to make sure to enable your team. And then the question is, if it's so important and we've seen why it matters, and I think there's also like we ultimately already sort of somehow know that it matters, then the question is why on earth is it so hard? Like, we all know it's important, so why is it so hard for us to actually get into this mode of constantly learning and sort of like taking feedback, building feedback into our routines, into our meetings, into our projects, and really make this the basis of our learning process? And I've basically brought sort of 3 feedback hacks that are sort of easy ways to start working on building feedback individually into your work as maybe an expert, a contributor on a team, but also as a people leader, as a founder, and to start building sort of this feedback into your daily routines. And the first hack is something that's actually also grounded in a lot of research and science. And it's, as humans, I mean, we are sort of like, our brain evolved throughout evolution. And whenever we've sort of like new information has been coming at us in the past, we had to evaluate really quickly, is it a threat? Do we need to fight or flight or freeze? So we needed to figure out in a matter of milliseconds how to react. And what happens usually, and the first feedback hack is sort of like for everyone individually, how do we perceive feedback, or what do we do with feedback? And what often happens is somebody tells us something that we might actually not do well yet, or something where we maybe haven't reacted in the sort of like most effective way. And they tell us, and the first thing we do is we almost like internally freeze. And it's like our animalistic part of our body that almost thinks it's like a threat. So actually our brain sort of understands this information in the wrong way and wants us to freeze or fight. So like tell the person to like, she's not doing it better, or you're doing it the same way. So I'm going into like a fight mode, or I'm going in a flight mode. I restrain, I have all these stress reactions, I start sweating. So that's the animalistic part of our brain kicking in and just taking this sort of like feedback as a threat. And there was an interesting research project where basically people were just told as a thought experiment to really perceive this feedback not as a threat, but really take sort of like conscious approach to think like, this is actually data that's helping me to sort of learn something from it. So it's pure reframing of how I perceive this information I'm getting as it's data. It's actually something that works really well with engineers or techie people. Just take it as a data point. And just through this reframing, you could see that even the bodily reactions that people had to this sort of feedback coming at them completely changed. So all of a sudden, people were able to actually take in this constructive feedback or even positive feedback, because some people even react slightly stressed to that because it's always weird to be on the spot all of a sudden, and take this as information that's just like one data point that helps me. And just this reframing and becoming aware of like, not just to like follow this animalistic part of your brain, but actually take a conscious sort of way how you sort of react to this information, tremendously changed the experience people had with feedback. So this is for all of you to like, whenever you get feedback that might be critical, just watch how your reactions are and try to like be more conscious and don't let the animalistic part of your brain kick in and just take this as something like maybe even threatening. So this is something we can do with a certain level of mindfulness or consciousness about how we react to this feedback data. And if the person that's giving us feedback sees like we're actually reacting in a bit more of a relaxed way, it's going to be easier for that person to give us feedback the next time. And so we get actually more data, more feedback that helps us to learn, to develop, to also know what we're doing well, but also maybe sometimes where we can still change. So that's the first feedback hack. It's as easy and as hard as just changing a mental model around the feedback you're receiving. Let's get to the second feedback hack. So Apple has put quite a lot of effort and research into their leadership development programs. And Kim Scott was one of the designers behind that program. And she wrote a really, I highly recommend it, a book about this concept of radical candor. So now we're actually swapping, because we just spoke about how we receive feedback. Now we're swapping, and now we're talking about how do we actually give feedback. And when we want to give feedback, we're actually trying to aim for what she calls radical candor. So there's actually two dimensions that you see here. There's the dimension of caring personally, and there's the dimension of challenging directly. And what we're aiming for is mastering both of them. We want to care personally, and we want to challenge directly. Let's actually go through this with a concrete example. Let's imagine we don't actually care personally, and we challenge directly. So we're here. We had obnoxious aggression. So let's imagine there's a bathroom over there. Our colleague Philip comes out of the bathroom and his stall is down. He's walking over at us, and what we do is we scream across the room. It's like, Philip is walking around with his pants unzipped. That's so funny. And everybody in the room is going to have a really good laugh. So we actually challenge him directly, but we don't really care for him. We care for us and everyone else to have a good laugh. This is not what we're aiming at. We could also be at the risk to get into manipulative insincerity. So he's walking out of the bathroom, and what we do is we see that his stall is down, but we don't actually want to be uncomfortable telling him. So we walk past him, we don't say anything. So we don't care for him, we care for us. We don't want to be awkward that we tell him, and we don't actually challenge him, so we don't help him to solve the situation. This is also not what we're aiming for. We could also be at risk of going into renewous empathy. So he walks at us, we see his stall is down, and we don't tell him because we don't want him to feel uncomfortable. So we actually care about him. We don't want him to feel uncomfortable. That's how we care about him. But we don't actually challenge him, like we don't actually tell him what's wrong, so he can't actually fix the situation. So this is also not what we want to aim at. Because like still there's not this data point, and there's not this challenging that helps him to understand what's wrong. So what we are aiming for is radical candor. He's walking out of the door. We don't want him to be sort of like ridiculous in the way of walking with a stall down through the entire office. So we walk over and we just calmly tell him, Philip, you want to close your pants? And we help him by challenging him directly, by telling him directly to fix the situation straight away. So this is something what requires us to actually confront the situation, making him aware of what's right or wrong, and basically doing that out of like a personal care for that person to be able to fix the situation. It's a bit of a sort of like stupid example, but it's actually showing in a very sort of like descriptive way of what we're trying to achieve. So if we don't tell him, he doesn't have the chance to fix it. And especially as people managers or as founders, we actually need to also like make sure that we do address this, and we don't just sort of like don't do it because it's easy. There's a question.
I was wondering whether she tested this in various cultural settings, because I think that could also, a radical candor may be more appropriate for the United States, where it might not be so in the East. I
mean, to be honest, I think there's some, I don't think there's a systematic testing in terms of like how does it work with one sort of like group against the other. At the same time, if you look at Apple as an organization, it's actually a very sort of like diverse organization, even though it's sort of like culturally influenced by sort of like sort of one geography or one culture. But at the same time, I think it's also like maybe the way you do approach the situation, like how direct you are, or maybe if you speak a bit in like a indirect way, might be sort of like person or culture specific. But I think the general concepts, at least for sort of like Europe, I would say does still hold value in itself. Do you agree or do you disagree? What's your thinking around it?
I think the words that she uses are very extreme in examples.
Yeah.
So if you just took radical candor, then that would be a little too much, perhaps.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if
Yeah.
she had tested that. Thank you.
All right, and we'll have a lot of time for discussion and questions at the end. The third mechanism, or the third feedback hack is mechanisms. And this is something that comes from change management. Because ultimately, when we have established a certain culture around learning, around feedback in our organizations, and we want to change that, it's a bit of actually an intentional way that we need to start thinking about how do we change that. And we humans are incredibly, it's hard for us to change habits. We're very habit-driven people. And maybe to quickly sort of like make that tangible, I'll take your hands and you fold them. And now you fold them the other way around, take the other thumb on top. And how does it feel? It feels uncomfortable and it feels really weird for most people, unless you, I don't know, a yoga practitioner or a monk or whatever that does that regularly. And that's the thing, we really want to go back into what feels comfortable straight away. And this is why we need to think about like, how do we make sure that this change in culture, in learning process, in feedback process is actually sustainable. And there's 4 things we need to address at the same time to make sure that this change in like how feedback and learning works is actually sticky. The first one, especially for the millennials, is we actually need to explain people why we're doing something. Like, why do we think like regular feedback, or why do we think continuous learning is actually important? Like, what's in for you? Like, why should you care? Is something that we really need to address. Then we also need to teach people a bit like the how. Like, for example, how do you actually give feedback in a relevant way? Like, we do a lot of nonviolent communication, for example, when we do feedback trainings. Like, I tell you what I observed. Like, I don't assume anything. So, like, that's actually another important element to make sure you train people, like, how to, for example, give feedback, how to perceive feedback, to be aware of your reaction that you have in terms of, like, I might be frightened by somebody telling me feedback, like what we spoke about was feedback hack number 1. And then you need role models. And we always, like, if we don't walk the talk, especially as founders, like you say, it's important for you that, like, there is a growth mindset, there is feedback taking place, but then you don't actually do it yourself, like, it doesn't really work. But also you need role models in a more decentral sort of place. So, like, not just the founder, but make sure, like, when you hire, that you hire for people that also maybe value this sort of growth mindset, and that you actually have sort of decentral role models also across the organization. And then what a lot of companies forget is you actually also need mechanisms. And the mechanisms is the guy, or sort of the imaginary guy or girl, that always taps us on the back when we go back into the original state of sort of keeping our fingers and not doing them the other way around that we said we want to do. And the mechanisms is really something where technology is actually quite powerful to remind you and always give you the hook or the entry point to get back into this like process of like requesting feedback, giving feedback individually, doing a team retrospective. You can also do it with specific events that you regularly do, but you just need some sort of mechanism that always reminds you and pulls you into the process that you said you want to achieve. And ultimately, you need to make sure you address all of these simultaneously. You don't need to train people first and then start doing things later, because then people might have forgotten what they actually learned. So it's a simultaneous thing that you want to make sure you address these things to really build this feedback and learning into your company and into your culture. so much for the feedback hacks. So we want to make sure we change our mental model around how we do feedback or how we receive feedback. It's not a threat, it's a data point. We want to make sure that we aim for radical candor. You might also call it differently, but I think the ultimate factor is like caring personally about the people on your team, and also making sure that you don't sort of shy away, but you actually challenge directly or you speak directly about what's not right. That's sort of like the second hack. And the third hack, to make sure you not only think about explaining the why, the how, and have the role models, but also make sure you do think about your mechanisms. And sort of when we had our journey of exploring, my co-founder and me, sort of like how do we build feedback and learning into companies, we realized that the mechanisms is often the weakest piece in a lot of companies. It's what people really ultimately forget, and then they wonder why they're actually not nailing or getting sustainable in the feedback and the continuous learning that they're trying to achieve. This is actually what we have built a company on. So what we do is we actually help companies, tech companies, but also established companies that aim for their digital transformation, to establish feedback at 3 layers. At the company level, we support companies with employee surveys, for example, to really gather this feedback from their employees to know what they're already doing well and what they need to improve on. At the team level, we help companies to ensure the clarity and the focus on what they're actually trying to achieve through, for example, goals or OKRs, company level, team level, individual level, through retrospective to gathering feedback at the team level to know what you're doing well as a team, what we need to work on as a team. And at the individual level, very important because the people are the core of the success of your company. We help companies to build continuous feedback into their processes in a digital feedback, through digital feedback processes, to have structured feedback with very good feedback talks, 360-degree feedback, probation period feedback, to really make sure that people know what they do well and what do they need to improve on, to have meaningful feedback conversations between employees and managers, and to actually build a layer of personalized learning on top. So this is sort of the essence how we help companies to achieve these mechanisms for feedback and learning at all levels, and to make that a bit more tangible. So you can, for example, request and give feedback in a digital way. And the interesting thing is what we see consistently throughout companies is that the digital feedback actually generates more personal feedback interactions. A lot of people are always afraid when they hear digital and feedback that it's actually gonna get people to not talk to each other anymore. And we see the opposite, because this is basically the guy typing out in the back to remember that we wanted to do that feedback. So whenever I get a digital feedback request, I might respond to it digitally, but then I go to the person and talk about it afterwards or ask for more context. We do the structured feedback processes because it's important to have feedback regularly, but then to also take a bit more time, maybe twice a year, for example, to actually sit down and really think about, as a manager or as a founder, sit down with your management team and say, hey, this is something you're doing amazing, do more of it. Or this is something that you need to maybe keep working on. So to take this time that you have a bit more time, a bit more structured, holistic feedback that complements the ongoing feedback that you have at an individual level. And we see that one of the most important elements to also bridge the digital and the non-digital is to really have good sort of check-ins between managers and employees. So this is actually the feature I personally also use the most, because we don't do any meeting where there isn't a clear agenda, where we don't sit down together to really know what we're going to be talking about, to then navigate into the latest feedback we've been giving each other, to make sure that we talk about the goals, so we really pull it together. And there was a big study by Google, Project Oxygen, that the core driver of the most successful teams were those teams where the managers were really coaching their employees in a very effective way, so to make sure that the employee gets everything they need from the manager in terms of not just feedback, but also guidance. And the one-on-one meetings is really where the essence of that coaching is actually taking place. And when we know what we're doing well and individually, we also need to know where we're actually trying to head as a company. So we need to have that clarity and this focus. What are we trying to achieve as a company, as a team? And what does it mean for me? What can I contribute? And having this clarity is basically the other side of knowing what I'm doing well or what I'm not doing so well yet is also knowing where I'm trying to aim, what I need to contribute. So this is the other side of generating this clarity, so I can also develop and learn in a sort of like dedicated way to help us move in the right direction. And then this is the last element that I was initially speaking about, making sure you generate the feedback from the employees also to the company, so you know what you already do well as a company on sort of like a systematic level and where you actually need to improve, and that you know also when things are sort of, as you scale, for example, like what my experience was scaling from 30 to 120 people, like do you actually see how like the manager support or the cultural alignment or the engagement is actually going down? Is it just people like being louder than others, or is there actually like data that shows that you're actually moving in the wrong direction there? So doing that, those systematic like surveys in a regular way to know where you're heading as a company and what you want to improve is also something that ultimately forms the learning and the feedback culture of your company, and also gives people the opportunity to actually voice their concerns and make sure that this is heard. And ultimately, feedback is the basis for learning. So we want to make sure what we actually do is we build personalized learning on top of this data, the competency data, the goals data we have, and make sure that it doesn't stay with knowing what I don't actually know well, but it actually helps me. I get the advice and the help to also work on improving in these areas. We work with tech companies and that work on scaling. So it's usually that companies at about like 60 to 80 employees are really thinking about like what mechanisms do I have to really help me scale this culture feedback and learning. But interesting, especially serial entrepreneurs often start thinking about mechanisms much earlier because they've already experienced in previous companies how it's so hard to get it right once you've got it initially wrong. So they usually start thinking about mechanisms at about 30 people. And we actually also work with a lot of big companies that are trying to change their current setup, that are trying to successfully make their culture of learning and feedback more agile, to really make sure to enable the people to learn at a completely different speed. And this is basically the setup where we support with mechanisms. And we're working with a lot of different companies, not just in Germany, but also across Europe and beyond. And we are currently hiring. So we're hiring an engineering product, the sales and marketing team, and an operations. So feel free to reach out if you are currently or know people that are looking for jobs. And we're always happy to also dive into the product much deeper. And I would love to have a bit more of a discussion with you where you disagree or where you agree, maybe what your personal experiences have been, like positive or negative with feedback, and how do you think about the whole matter? Anyone? Anyone has their own experience with feedback or learning? They want to share a company that was where things were really good in that essence, or where it was really bad, or where it got lost as you scaled. Anyone wants to share something?
One point very interesting for me, including feedback not as a critique, is important to mention. An employee always has an isle of knowledge, and for the company it's most important actually to only give feedback or receive feedback, but also there's this employee very important for the company with its knowledge. It takes like a year to fully be productive. So how can you within these feedback talks have an exchange of knowledge so that you are updated with everything, so that the employee decides to leave or whatever way, so that this isle of knowledge is not swimming away.
Yeah.
So this is something, it's not about like impulse feedback on how the emotions are and how I'm not. It's also about like how to guarantee knowledge transfer between potential level and level.
Yeah. And even peer-to-peer maybe, right?
Peer-to-peer, but also mostly there's sometimes a gap. And how to guarantee also peer-to-peer.
Could you speak up a bit on
Did you?
Yes.
It's not working? Okay. Okay.
But no, it's not working. I lost somebody for me.
Okay. So the question was, I'll just repeat it. In brief, basically, there's often a knowledge gap between like employees and managers, or like employees and the C-level. So can this sort of mechanism of feedback and learning also ensure that this knowledge gap is actually like tightened? Did I?
Yeah, it's more an idle. Like every
Okay.
mostly have like these idols of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm on my position for 3 years.
Yeah.
I'm very good at that.
Yeah.
So I'm leaving now.
Yeah.
It's like at least a year to get a new employee.
Yeah.
Practical knowledge.
Yeah.
Maybe he doesn't have the full knowledge I had.
Yeah.
So he was like putting a lot of investment in me as an
Yeah.
employee. Now I'm leaving.
Yeah.
What happens with my knowledge?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's why you should also use these feedback talks.
Yeah.
Not talking about past,
Yeah.
what's it, talking about the general perspective.
Yeah.
What is your participation, your part in that company right now?
Yeah. And interestingly, I think I fully agree. I think this is something where ultimately, like, and probably it's not even necessarily the feedback talks. I would say it's more the check-ins. If you do, for example, we do weekly check-ins. I think bi-weekly check-ins is also a way that works quite well. And I think ultimately the check-ins are where the employee and the manager sit down together, is where a lot of this transfer of knowledge effectively, in my world, actually takes place. And where, for example, I would always ask as a manager, like, is there anything that you would change or that you would improve? So like, because different people see different things, right? And to make sure that at least maybe, and I think it's unrealistic that the manager will have all the knowledge that you have doing the daily sort of like operational work and like your expertise, because you're much deeper in there. But I would at least make sure that all your sort of like ideas you have, how we can make the structures, the processes better, maybe how we document the knowledge, I would ask that, sort of like make that a consistent topic of my one-on-one. Like, what's the way to document your knowledge? Like, what should we change in our structures and our processes? And that's really the sort of like continuous learning and sort of like making sure to build on that knowledge that you want to have part of your structures, really. And I think the ultimate thing is also, how do you generate this learning between employees or between peers? Because it's probably more realistic that somebody who might be working quite related to what you do on the team can ultimately observe that knowledge even much better than your manager maybe can. So make sure that this is part of the team meetings, or that you have certain pairing in terms of making sure that you have this sort of like not sort of vertical but more horizontal sort of like knowledge sharing. But I think it's usually probably the employee that has the expertise, that has the best knowledge on how to document it in a very effective way. And the manager might be a sparrings partner to make sure that this might be also consistent with how learnings and knowledge is documented in another part of the organization. But I would always build on the knowledge of the employee rather than just sort of the manager to make sure it's the best idea how that can be sort of like done in a scalable way. Yeah. But it's an old challenge, right? Like, I mean, you can't, and maybe you're trying to just keep that person stay in your company by making a good environment for them in the first place. But that won't be possible forever.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect to this basically value of knowledge, and first like connecting with the story that happened. So I recently negotiated my salary, and I asked for something, and they didn't want to give me what I was expecting. And at the end, I convinced them, saying, "Look, if you don't give me what I want, I'm not gonna stay. And if I'm not gonna stay, you have to hire someone, and you're gonna take, I don't know, 2 months, 3 months. Plus, even if you find someone that will request less than me with more experience, it will take a certain amount of time to train this person to the product or anything else. And if you calculate this, it's basically the same money that I'm asking you. Like, at the end, my founder convinced himself and he gave me what I wanted. But the question is, first, I don't know if actually like that was really worth it for him. Honestly, I don't care. I got what I want. But from this side of knowledge value, the interesting part would be also from the founder side to understand actually how valuable is the knowledge of an employee, for example. How can we measure this value? Is there a method to measure this value? It just as a feeling, or how can we do that?
To also do that. And actually work on and develop. Like, I mean, there's different ways you can play around with it. Like, for example, we also
we're fully customizable, for example, and we've seen that in some companies it actually works really well if you give people access initially to feedback that just they themselves can see. So like instant feedback for us is always anonymous. It's actually never like your manager, HR can never actually see it. And even on like the more structured revenue processes, you do 360, you can even set it up the way that it's just the recipient that actually sees the results. And ultimately, what we need to do, I mean, even especially to convince people that are more skeptical, is actually give them, convince them to maybe do the first tiny baby step. And like your CTO is probably your best potential like partner and role model to get people to do this tiny baby steps. So don't get commitment for them for like we're going to do this in the next 5 years, but let's try it once. And then what you ultimately need to do is to create positive like experiences straight away. Like it needs to be actually relevant and helpful for people like straight away. And what we see, for example, is that we humans are quite curious, right? So I actually do kind of want to understand like what my strengths are and like what other people consider my strengths. So you can use this curiosity, right? It's like we're doing a 360. You're gonna sort of like get a bit more of an understanding of your personal strengths profile. It's just going to be visible to you, and this is actually something that already also has value for everyone involved, right? Because people to know their strengths is so important in terms of like strength-based development. So this is sort of like the hook and the first entry step, where people have a positive experience, and then it's easier sort of like to convince people of the next step. Yeah, thank you.
It's a bit opposite. It's about introducing this culture into the smaller group of people who are friends with each other. Because in this case, they are already biased in a way. So how would you go around it?
I mean, so what we actually see quite often with like this is instant feedback. It's completely private. So if you send me feedback, it's visible for you and me. It's never anonymous, but just the two of us see it. Like neither your manager nor my manager will ever be able to look into it. Not even the admin can look into that. It's just between the two of us, one-on-one relationship. And I mean, what we see as a general pattern is that oftentimes in the beginning, it's a lot of more like positive feedback or praise that's sent through that. But actually and that again, like being German, we always think like just negative feedback is good feedback. But actually also like positive feedback is super important to know your own personal strengths profile, right? And like, again, like neuroscience and sort of evolution, negative experiences are much more like memorable for us than positive experiences. So there's a lot of like research, neuroscientific research, that you need to tell a person about 5 times as often what they do good compared to telling them once what they do bad, to make it as sticky and memorable, right? Because in the past, like when we're eating the cake and there was a snake coming, like the impulse to run away from the snake needed to be more like lively than like the impulse to eat the cake. So like we actually need to tell people very often what they do good. So it's like making it easy for people and like sticky, the hook for people to just give this feedback on the go, like maybe slightly more positive in the beginning, but then have an understanding of your strengths profile, and then you're building the trust to actually allow a bit more critical things to then be set later on. And maybe then that's something, and this trust is something that you can build through positive feedback, and that actually then pays into like opening the space for also, you know, speaking about the things that maybe just didn't go well, to like start challenging directly. So this is sort of like a usual sort of development path we see. Yeah. Sorry. Let's do this one and then we jump over. Sorry that I wasn't looking into this direction. You were just right in my field of view.
My name is Abdashi. I am from India. My question is from a product point of view. Like I see it as a software as a service product, and you said that you have some level of customizability built into your product, which means that whether you are targeting buyer or whether you are targeting N26, you will do some sort of customization. So my experience is because I have got a chance to work in Accenture, and I've got a chance to work in a very 50-member startup. In Accenture, they have a project manager who has a certain number of leads resources, and every project manager would fight for their resources. And as a low-level resource, you just need to write down what you did well in certain 3 categories. My question is that which sort of companies do you see this product fit into, and how do you, as a product, still keep a place for customizability and scale? You know, like, and at what point do you take, you know, a certain company as your typical company and then design a product? So how did you go about it?
So I mean, so first of all, like, we don't customize. Like, the customer customizes in self-service. So like, there's just different like flexibility as to what modules I use, how I set up processes, visibility, so and all of that. Like, so we don't touch the product for every customer. And basically, we just started off, we're a fully bootstrapped company up until this point. So we just needed to actually build a product that shipped and that actually customers bought. So when you start off and you don't actually necessarily have like a lot of credibility already, we ended up sort of tapping into tech companies where we had a network. And so we started working with tech companies. And basically, you iterate on the product comes a lot better. Like, I mean, the first version of the product we shipped was just 1 module. Now we have like 5 different modules that are like really like working really well together, and it's like a full suite. So we started selling to tech companies first. And then we actually we realized that there's so much interest actually from bigger companies. And so we sort of like walking our way up the food chain to actually sell to bigger companies. We, however, sort of like we segment the market a bit more culturally when it comes to big companies. So it's those companies that take a strategic effort to really work on their digital transformation. And then interestingly, the use case is not even that dissimilar to the tech companies. The tech companies want to scale sort of like a certain sort of like agile feedback and learning culture they have. And the big companies want to build it. Obviously, the change management around it is a tiny bit different. But product-wise, I mean, obviously, there's a lot more like different complexity and features that you have for enterprise that you don't have for tech customers. But ultimately, the product actually, interestingly, looks very similar still between like an MDAX or a DAX company, where it's at least like some part of the population, the employees using it, as to like a fast-growing tech company. And then obviously like your pitch and like how the complexity of the sales process is much more different than the product actually is. And interestingly, it actually works also across geographies, right? Because it's not so dissimilar being a tech company in, I don't know, Tel Aviv or Berlin or France or the US or Sao Paulo. Languages might differ. Yeah. So now over to this side.
I didn't really get how you combine the digital and the personal feedback. I assume that people behave a lot different when they give digital feedback than personal feedback. And maybe it also depends on the package that you sell, but yeah, that would be nice to understand a bit more deeply.
Yeah. So basically what I was trying to say or said was what we see, like, so for example, let's make it very tangible. I can, from within the platform or Slack or my Gmail add-on, can basically request feedback from anyone in my company at any time. So let's imagine 3 of us have been working in a project together. You're from engineering, you're from marketing, I'm from sales. I could basically just look for the 2 of you, add you like via Slack or via sort of the interface to my feedback request and ask you like, how did I lead the, I don't know, product workshop. Might not be me sales leading the product workshop, but just like imagine that's the way it would be. And then basically I could also ask for some more specific feedback, like how did I provide structure, how did I don't know, drive innovation in that process. There's like certain skills that are you can customize or build into the platform. And then the 2 of you give me feedback. And then I see your feedback, but then it's not enough depth for me. And I actually want to hear a bit more of an example. I see you at the coffee machine, and I say like, hey, thank you for that feedback. Like, can you give me a bit more context? Like, what did you like? What did you not like? So we're actually triggering these interactions. And what we also see is we make it very easy for people because we have like certain skills or core values or competencies built into the platform that you can select, like the ones you see here, for example. And that actually helps me to tell you what I would like to have feedback on. It's easier for you to then give me feedback, and I actually get more specific feedback from you guys. So we both have a better feedback experience. Easier for you, better result for me. So we're actually generating positive experiences on both sides. And if I have a positive experience, I'm more likely to do more of it. So this is basically, but then it's like, it's spilling over. I ask you at the coffee machine, we meet on the bus, and it's just like the patterns we see that the two influence one another. But there's, in an abstract way, a huge fear that digital like removes any sort of like personal face-to-face contact, but it's just not what we see.
So it's not really structured. It's more like a tool to establish a culture where feedback is growing. Like because you use the digital feedback, it makes it easier to talk to each other and to learn.
Well, I mean, ultimately, it all comes back to the mechanisms.
Yeah.
Like, so the sum of what we do on a daily basis and our assumptions about how we want to interact, what we do, ultimately builds the culture, right? So by changing the habits, by creating the mechanisms, by setting the hooks directly in your Slack, directly with Slack integration, with Gmail integration, it's basically creating those hooks to always get you into the interaction, and that ultimately changes culture. And I mean, it's interestingly, there's certain interactions, like for example, if I'm the manager and I'm actually asking you for feedback via the platform, like I'm sending you a feedback request, like it's a very like real sort of like trigger that tells you like, I actually want to hear like your feedback. And that is something like, if I just say like, guys, give me a feedback if you have anything, like it's not as strong, right? So like it's always like manifesting that this is actually something that we really want to do and live. Or if I get a survey, like my monthly or weekly survey, like, yeah, the company actually wants to hear my opinion, what I think. But then obviously you need to also do something with it. So like for surveys, for example, super important, like if you have an all hands meeting, like make sure you actually talk about what you learned from the surveys, like because nothing is worse than like, you know, somewhere in the off, like it disappeared, nobody knows what happens with it. So you actually always need to build those bridges between digital and the real world. And I mean, for example, we also do public praise. Like I know some companies actually read out those public praise again in the all hands meeting, right? It's like nice little bridges like that you can build between online and offline, but both together build habit and influence culture ultimately.
I'll try to talk a little loud. Can you hear me? It's a little hard to hear the others. So, particularly with this in the back. I have a question of which tools are you capturing, replacing, or integrating with within the organizations that you've been working with? Because I could imagine I saw goals. So companies already have a structure to set up goals, and this is all towards personnel discussions. So the feedback, the quarterly or annual review. There's project management, team inputs that I'm hearing. So that made me think, okay, is this a tool that's supposed to replace or integrate with or capture some of these things?
So ultimately, the bracket around what we do is we enable people in organizations, right? Clarity, what we're trying to achieve, knowing what I do well, what I don't do well, and making sure the context, the company, through surveys, is sort of the best context for everyone to be sort of like productive, successful, happy in. How we integrate, so basically we integrate with HR tools because we don't want HR professionals to have to, you know, have input employee data into two systems. It just wouldn't make sense, right? So we integrate with a partnership with like a Personio, for example. We integrate with Bamboo HR. We integrate with Active Directory or HRIS systems in bigger companies, right? That's where the employee data comes for. Saves a whole lot of time for HR people. Then on the employee side, on the user side, it's a lot more important to actually integrate with where the communication actually happens, right? Where do I communicate with you guys? And that's Slack or other team chats, or it's actually still emails. Like I get an email from you, and I'm not on a point that I want to talk to you about in the next one-on-one meeting we're having, right? So I don't have to leave my Google interface or my Slack interface where our communication is actually taking place. So these are the most important integrations. And on the side of what do we replace, it really depends on the context. There, tech versus enterprise actually differs. And in tech, to be honest, often we replace like Google Forms or Excel sheets or like super painful manual process. Somebody is nodding in the back who's done that. So basically, it's pen and paper, it's Excel, it's Google Forms in the tech world, or it's maybe other tools that were used in the space that people weren't satisfied with. In the enterprise world, it's usually that we create a layer that's because there's like this traditional goal management system, this traditional appraisal system, so people are super tired about it. It's like, it's not lean, it's not like fun, it's very like, it's anything but lightweight. And people want to work in like an environment or are used to like a certain usability and a certain like ease and fast, also speed of interaction. And then it's often that we actually create a layer that's where the instant feedback, for example, is taking place completely independent of the traditional performance system, for example. And actually, it makes things sometimes even easier. Or 360-degree feedback, traditionally something that's only been available to like top leadership level because it's also been really expensive. So we actually democratize that and make sure that this like really effective like mentoring and people development suite is not just available to the top, but it's actually available to a really broad population of employees. So like technology lets us democratize and make it available to a much larger population in these companies. And also if I'm working for like a big DAX company or an MDAX company and we try to like work in a sort of like an agile way, and then I have all these like heavyweight systems, like it just doesn't, like it's such a clash. So I want to have a system where I don't only set individual goals, but I set like department or team goals, and we contribute on them. Like we see where we stand. Like it's a process that's completely different from how these old enterprise systems work. So there, right now, we're often set next to them, but ultimately, I mean, we want to replace them.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Well, there's actually someone behind you that, but you'll be the next.
I just wanted to get more tips about giving negative feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about feedback, or when it's just positive, you can speak publicly in front of the team, everyone and just praise.
Yeah.
But when you talk feedback, it's rather going to actually negative feedback and to learn from mistakes and improve.
Yeah.
And usually people go into self-defense mode and start justifying why they did it, just finding the reason to justify instead of listening and trying to improve.
Yeah.
And what's the right way to do negative feedback so
Yeah.
that people are more willing to accept it and recognize some
Mm-hmm.
mistakes, stand up for own mistake and try to improve it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think it's super important, like helpful to actually speak about this sort of with the team and make everyone aware of it. Guys, it's not easy for like no one. It's for most people, it's not easy to actually receive feedback because we have this sort of like animalistic brain and we think it's like frightening information and we want to fight or flight. Like either I tell you you do it similarly or I like freeze. And so basically talking about this and making everyone aware of this is laying a really, really good foundation. And then generally when you give someone sort of like more negative feedback or more constructive feedback, what I personally often do is, for example, if I'm generally happy with what the person does, but it's like some element that's not working, I say like overall I'm super happy with what you're doing. So I'm like setting the scene, and then I'm diving into sort of like the more sort of like negative part. And generally for sort of like feedback in general, actually both positive or negative, I personally think like nonviolent communication is like a super effective framework. So I basically state what I observed, like my observation, and then I basically, so for example, like you've been, let's imagine you've always been late. So I say like I've been observing or I've been seeing that you've always been coming to the office at like 11 for the past 3 weeks. Maybe then ask, and that's maybe something that we agreed otherwise. I would ask like, is there anything that I should be aware of? Like, is there any sort of like personal matters? So making sure like to check in on that. And then basically, rather than saying like, you're always late, like it gets across very aggressive. The person might get super like pushing you away. Say like, if you're always late, I'm really worried that the work or the big project or the feature is not going to be shipped. So like stating why this is actually something that makes you sort of like annoyed or uncomfortable, or basically, but saying like what you observed, what your sort of like interpretation potentially is, but not actually saying like you always, you, so like these words, it's always best to sort of stay away from, but there's great sort of like resources on nonviolent communication that summarize that concept like a lot of depth, but I think that's generally like a helpful framework to have in mind, like state observations rather than assumptions, and basically start from yourself rather than saying like start from the other person, because that's making it easier to actually to get the message across and find a resolution that actually works for both sides. Was that helpful? Now,
your company prides itself with being an AI-based company. So what is it you're actually measuring? So is it like the top-level employer like judging whether or not feedback is successful? And what is it actually does? So is it the recommendations for the person?
it's the learning part. So basically, we are generating an understanding of the competency profile of the person, and ultimately also like what the person is working on, potentially when goals are activated, and generating learning recommendation on top of that data.
But there's not like predictive, like you saying, all right, this would be a good hire for you because like they had similar employees that continuously got good feedback. But it's rather like you got this kind of feedback for this person, so this person is aligned with this other person, so this is what they like.
We have a lot of ideas, but we can't do everything at the same time. The challenge that everyone has. Yeah. Go ahead.
Coming back to the previous point, what I think, the key start for giving good feedback is basically understanding your employee or your reporter or your peer even. What kind of drives them? How do they tick? How do they what do they want to achieve? And that really then sets the stage of how you give feedback.
Yeah.
And there's multiple ways. I mean, some people would be very awkward if you do it in a formalized situation. So you let it take them for lunch or something like that, or alternatively, other people like formal situations and like very clear and blatant feedback. So, and it's, I think, not only a cultural thing, it's also, like very, very dependent on each and every individual.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I think for me that would be actually part of care personally, like especially as the people manager, I ideally like know my employees, like, and as you said, right, maybe one person I'm going to take a walk around the block when I'm saying something critical, because we can walk both and look into the same direction. We don't actually the person doesn't have to look at me. So I think that's something that I would sort of like also see in the care personally. I think it's really good idea even for sort of like smaller companies to invest into also leadership development, right? Getting that sort of like level of self-reflection and reflection on other people as the people manager is super important. Yeah, fully agree. Very important point. Thank you for bringing that up. Anything else? Everyone ready to go home, get some food, drink some wines? Perfect. Sorry, didn't see you.
When do you see this process start? So we've spoken a lot about, okay, this person's actually in their job, they're at the company, and we go through this process. But at least to my experience, I think the part where you screw up the most is already an onboarding, or even actually the interview process. So if you had a terrible onboarding experience or it's very inefficient, everything from there is whatever you want to make of it. And I know, for example, Personia, they do their own onboarding functionalities, but how do you integrate with them? How does that work for you guys?
So, very important point also. We don't cover the recruiting side, like as a tool, but I mean, for how I can share how we do it personally. So we have very clear understanding what we're actually looking for, and then we do a very structured interview process where we actually also like interview and test against also like sort of cultural parameters. How are we working? Like, is there a fit? So I think a structured interview process is something that's like your best guess on getting that right. And then what we also put a lot of emphasis on to make sure like every person, when they come on the first day, have access to all the tools they need. They have like a document with sort of like all the sort of like everything they need to know for onboarding, like the first objectives, like who will they meet, who will tell them about, I don't know, sales, marketing, product, whatever. So having that sort of clearly sort of like all prepared. But then ultimately it's like, again, the suite of ensuring that the person gets up to speed quickly is also like, again, all these different things. Like, do you actually make sure that you give that person feedback like in a digital or non-digital way very quickly? Like, what are you doing already well? Like, what do we need to sort of like jointly, like, where do we as a company maybe need to generate more clarity, what our expectations are, for example. So making sure that this feedback is like even more important in the initial weeks, like having structured like check-ins throughout the probation period, right? Like a mid-probation check-in, or maybe even earlier than then maybe in the 5th month, like just making sure you have this ongoing feedback, but also like the more structured feedback throughout the probation period. And I think one-on-one meetings, like with new hires, we do them generally twice as often as with sort of like regular employees, to just make sure you have this constant like realignment, especially in the initial phase. Do you know what your objectives are? Do you have everything you need from us? Like also just asking questions, like, and making sure that the instant feedback, the more structured feedback, the regular one-on-ones, and the clarity on objectives is like very, very sort of clearly set and like fine-tuned in the initial weeks and months. And I think that's like your best guess as a founder, to also make sure the expensive talent you hire is up to speed as quickly as possible, and also use that time to really also explore for both sides if it actually makes sense for both to have a sustainable relationship. Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I think this was very interesting. Thank you very much.
For a very nice lecture. We hope to see you again here.
Yes.
Come by.
Thanks for inviting me.
For all of you guys, you can hang around. I am very strict and I'm kicking you out all at 8. But until then, the tap is open. Just grab yourselves beer or coffee or tea or whatever, and hang around and talk to each other.
Muss ich da einmal draufdrücken?